My name is Brooke Rutledge, and at 33 I spent every last dollar I had on a gas station my whole family called a grave. The day I signed the papers, my mother told me to my face that I was a fool, and my father just looked at the wall. My brother Wade laughed and said I was a hopeless failure. They were gone before the ink was dry. 1 week later, I stood in the dark behind that old convenience store, staring at a steel door somebody had plastered over on purpose. What I found behind that wall 1 week later didn't just change my life. It rewrote the one story my family had spent 40 years telling about itself. And the day I finally said it out loud at my father's own gala, the whole room went quiet. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, the channel where ordinary women set hard boundaries, keep their dignity, and let the truth do the talking. If a quiet comeback is your kind of story, you're in the right place. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from, and be sure to subscribe so the next one finds you. The title company in Calico Bend has one conference room, and that morning, my whole family came to fill it. I don't know how they found out about the closing. Probably Dale. My father, Garrett Rutledge, walked in like he was inspecting a job site. And my mother, Lorraine, sat across from me with her purse in her lap, like she might need to leave fast. I had a cashier's check for the full amount in front of me, $41,000. Every cent I'd saved in 11 years. The escrow officer slid the deed across the table, and my mother said quiet and clear, "You're throwing your life in a ditch." I uncapped the pen. My father didn't sit. He stood by the window with his back to me and said, "Real rootage spilled something. They don't go digging through other people's trash." It landed exactly where he aimed it. Wade leaned against the door frame, arms crossed, grinning like this was the best show in town. "You know what you are, Brooke?" he said. "You're a hopeless failure." I signed my name. The pen didn't shake, which surprised me more than anything they'd said. The escrow officer cleared her throat and asked if I wanted a copy of the recorded deed mailed or emailed. "Both," I said. My family filed out. My father never turned around. Through the window, I watched his truck pull out of the lot and WDs behind it, and then my mother's sedan. 3 sets of taillights going back toward town, and the life that had no room in it for me. I sat alone with a deed to a dead gas station 10 minutes up Route 9, and a bank account that now read $84.16. There was no version of this where I got my money back. I had already won the only argument that mattered and lost everyone in the room. People in town thought I was the Rutledge who couldn't hold anything together. The truth was duller and worse. For 6 years, I kept the books for Rutledge Land and Holdings, my father's company, and I was good at it. Then there was a land deal in 2019, a strip parcel off the county road, and the numbers Wade wanted me to record didn't match the numbers that actually moved. I flagged it twice in writing. He told me to leave it alone, that I didn't understand how deals breathed. When the county came asking questions, the paperwork had my initials on the entries and WD's fingerprints nowhere. My father chose to believe his son. I didn't fight it the way I should have because fighting your own family in public felt like setting fire to your own house, so I left. I hung my own shingle, Rutledge Bookkeeping, a one-woman shop in a rented suite on 2nd Street. For 2 years, I did honest work for honest people, and it almost held. Then my biggest client, a contractor who owed me 8 months of fees, filed bankruptcy and took my margins with him. I closed the suite in March. I am the kind of person who reads the fine print twice and still apologizes for taking up the room. Over-responsible, my old boss called it back when I had a boss. I carry other people's mistakes like their rent I owe. That's the weakness nobody in my family ever noticed because it always worked in their favor. So, when Dale Mercer told me about a property nobody wanted, cheap enough that a woman with $84 and a ruined name could own it free and clear, I listened. I should have asked why he was so eager to help. I did ask. The answer just took me a while to find. Dale Mercer flips properties in Calico Bend. He buys dead things cheap, paints over the rot, and sells them to people who don't look underneath. He'd done a little work for my father over the years, which should have been my first warning. He found me at the diner on Route 9, slid into the booth, and said he had something perfect for me. The old Howard station, 10 minutes out on the old highway, shut down since 1987. Asking price, $41,000. Land alone is worth more, he said. Owners and estate back east. They just want it gone. It sounded too clean, and I knew it. So, I did what I do. I pulled the title myself at the county recorder office and read every transfer back to the 1930s. Clear. No liens. I called the state about the underground tanks because abandoned stations are environmental nightmares, and the file showed the tanks had been pulled and certified clean in 1991. I walked the parcel twice. I paid $200 I didn't have for a quick structural look from a retired inspector named Pete who said the bones were good, and the roof was a liability. Everything checked. The price was low, but the place was an eyesore on a road nobody drove anymore, and the seller was a tired estate. That math closed. I bought it because it was the only door my $84 could open, and because for once I wanted to own something that was mine before anyone could put their name on it. What I didn't check was Dale's face when I told him I was paying cash and skipping the inspection contingency he'd suggested. He smiled too wide and said, "Smart girl." Then he stepped outside the diner and made a phone call I couldn't hear. You have to understand what the name Rutledge means in Calico Bend. My grandfather, Amos Rutledge, came here with nothing in the 30s and ended up owning half the storefronts on Main. My father took that and built Rutledge Land and Holdings into the company that put up every subdivision, strip center, and frontage road in the county for 30 years. There is a Rutledge wing at the hospital. There is a Rutledge scholarship at the high school. When people in this town said the name, they said it the way you'd say a landmark. And that fall the Chamber of Commerce was set to name my father Citizen of the Year at the Founders' Day Gala, the biggest night Calico Bend throws 200 people. The mayor of the paper, my father, had been the unofficial king of this town my whole life, and now they were going to crown him in front of everyone. I grew up understanding that the name was a roof we all lived under, and that roof had rules. You did not embarrass it. You did not strike out on your own and make people whisper. And you absolutely did not buy the ugliest building on Route 9 with your last dollar the same season your father was being honored. My mother said I'd done it on purpose to humiliate them. I hadn't. I'd done it because it was the only thing I could afford, and the only thing that could be wholly legally mine. But I knew the gala was coming. I knew my father would be up on that stage in October with a plaque and a microphone, and the whole town watching. I just had no idea, yet that the same stage would be where everything finally broke open. The first night I owned the place, I went out alone with a flashlight and a thermos of coffee. The Howard station sat low against the dark, 2 dead pumps out front and a convenience store tacked onto the side, the windows gone milky with dust. I let myself in with the key the escrow officer had handed me in a yellow envelope. The smell hit me first. Old diesel soaked into concrete, and under it something chalky and damp like wet lime, and plaster left to cure in the dark for 40 years. It wasn't a bad smell exactly. It was the smell of something sealed up and waiting. I walked the front room. The empty coolers, the cash counter with its rusted register still bolted down. Behind the convenience store, there was a storage room, maybe 12x20, lined with collapsed metal shelving and a back wall that had been finished in cheap paneling sometime in the 80s. I ran my hand along it. Then, because I am the kind of person who can't leave a wrong number alone, I knocked. The front and side walls knocked back solid. The back wall sounded wrong. Hollow, but not the hollow of an empty stud bay. Deeper. There was a cool draft coming from a seam where the paneling met the floor. Steady like the building was breathing out. I stood there a long time with my hand flat against that cheap paneling. $84 to my name, and the whole town laughing at me, listening to a wall exhale. I told myself it was probably a crawl space, a pipe chase. Nothing. But I went home that night and couldn't sleep because the back wall of my dead gas station sounded like it was hiding something on purpose. My mother called the next morning before I'd finished my coffee. She doesn't open with hello. Your father didn't sleep. She said, "Do you know what people are saying?" I said, "I had a fair guess." She told me Pastor Reed had asked after me at the prayer breakfast in that voice people use when they mean, "Is she all right in the head?" She told me the Hendersons had seen my car out at the Howard place. She told me I was making my father a punchline in his own town the season they were honoring him. Come to the gala. She said stand with the family. Let people see we're together and quietly let that property go. I said I wasn't going to let it go. There was a silence, and then she said the thing she always says, the thing that used to work. Family closes ranks. Brooke, you chose the door. I'd heard that line my whole life, usually right before I gave in. This time, I just held the phone and looked out my apartment window at the mesa going gold in the morning sun. I love you, Mom, I said. I'm keeping the station, and I hung up before she could find the next handle to grab me by. If you've ever had your own family tell you exactly what you'll never become, you already know how that voice follows you into a quiet room at night. Stay with me because the wall I was about to open didn't just hold a secret. It held the proof. If this is hitting close to home, hit subscribe and ride this one out with me. I drove back out to Route 9 that afternoon with a crowbar in the back seat, and I was done waiting on that wall. I made myself a plan first on a legal pad at the counter, because a plan is the only thing that ever calms me down. Roof, then windows, then power. I had no money, so the plan was mostly sweat and patience, and whatever I could trade for. I figured I could open a small repair shop or a snack stop for the few trucks that still took the old highway. Just enough to keep the lights on while I decided what the place could really be. If it failed, I had nothing. Not savings, not a fallback, not a family door to knock on. That was the deal I'd signed. So I worked. I hauled out the dead shelving and swept 4 decades of grit. And the smell of diesel and damp lime came up off the floor again, stronger now that I disturbed it, riding on the dust. By late afternoon, I stood in front of the 80s paneling with my crowbar. I told myself I'd just take one panel off, and look. The first sheet came away with a shriek of old nails, and a breath of cold air rolled out over my feet. Behind the cheap paneling, there was no crawl space. There was a wall of poured concrete, smooth and deliberate, and set into it a steel door, not a closet door. A heavy slab of riveted steel with a rotary bolt handle, the kind you'd see on an old bank vault, sealed shut and painted over, and then walled in by somebody who wanted it forgotten. Someone had hidden this on purpose twice. Once behind concrete, then again behind paneling. I stood there holding the crowbar with my heart going hard, and I knew 2 things at once. This was bigger than a gas station, and I was the only person on earth who knew it was here. I didn't pry it open that night, and I want you to know why. Because it tells you everything about how this ended. My whole life, my family treated me like the girl who couldn't see so I make myself slow down. I photographed the door from every angle. I wrote down the date, the time, the condition of the seal. I measured it. Then I went home and started reading because the only thing I trust more than a plan is a record. The Howeren station, it turned out, wasn't built as a station. The parcel showed up in the county history as a bonded warehouse put up in the early 1920s by a man named Ian Howeren. Bonded meant the federal government licensed it to store goods under seal, taxes paid on the way out. During Prohibition, a bonded warehouse was one of the few legal places liquor could exist. Medicinal permits, government stock, distillery holdings frozen by the law. The building became a gas station in 1936 after the Howerens were gone. And somewhere in that conversion, someone had bricked up the old bonded room and built a convenience store over the memory of it. I sat at my kitchen table at 2 a.m. with printouts spread everywhere and felt the shape of it land on me. There was a sealed room behind my storage wall that had been built to hold things under federal seal, and it had been hidden deliberately for 90 years. I went back out the next day and worked the painted bolt loose with penetrating oil and patience, an inch at a time, until the handle finally turned with a groan that echoed down into something below. The door swung in 2 and stopped. Beyond it, I could see the top of a stone stairway going down into a black that smelled faintly of oak. I went down 12 stone steps with my flashlight in one hand and my phone recording in the other, because I wanted a record of the first moment untouched. The smell I'd been chasing since the first night opened up around me at the bottom. Diesel and damp lime still, but layered over with something older and sweeter now, charred oak and slow-rotting paper. The smell of things that had been aging in the dark longer than I'd been alive. The cellar was bigger than the storage room above it. Stone walls, a vate brick ceiling, and racks, wooden racks running the length of the room. And on them, in the beam of my light, rows of dark glass, bottles, hundreds of them, wrapped in straw and brittle paper, packed in crates stamped with faded ink. I lifted one carefully out of its nest of straw and turned it in the light. The glass was hand-blown, heavy, sealed with wax over the cork, and the label, though spotted, was legible. A bonded whiskey, the strip stamp still across the cap, a date in the corner that started with 19 and a 2. My hands were not steady anymore. I have read enough to know what a single bottle of authenticated, bonded, pre-repeal whiskey can bring at auction. $1,000 is the low end. The famous bottles bring far more. And I was standing in a stone room with rack after rack of them, 90 years sealed, the wax intact. I did not whoop. I did not call anyone. I stood very still in that cold cellar and did the only thing my brain knows how to do under pressure. I started counting crates, then bottles per crate, then the math, and the number it gave me was so large that I made myself sit down on the bottom step in the dark and breathe before I let myself believe it. Here's the thing my family never understood about me. The bottles weren't the win. The win was provenance. Anybody can find old liquor in a wall and half of it gets seized, smashed, or sold for nothing because nobody can prove what it is or where it came from. I'd read about a couple back east who found 66 bottles in their floorboards and a vault in Los Angeles full of bonded cases behind a fake bookcase that went to a real auction house for real money. The difference between a curiosity and a fortune is paper. Who made it? Who bonded it? Who owned it? An unbroken chain from then to the bottle in your hand. So instead of telling a soul, I spent the next 2 days being a bookkeeper. I photographed every crate, every stamp, every label, and logged them in a spreadsheet like inventory. I did not move anything more than I had to. I found a fine spirits auction house in Denver that handled exactly this kind of thing, and I emailed them careful and plain as the verified legal owner of the property asking what authentication would require. They emailed back within an hour. They were very, very interested. They wanted dates. They wanted photos, and above all they wanted any original documentation tying the cash to the bonded warehouse because that the appraiser wrote was the difference between a good sale and a historic one. Documentation, of course. I went back down into the cellar with new eyes, not looking at the bottles now but at the room itself, the corners, the old desk shoved against the far wall. Anything that a careful man storing things under federal seal would have kept. A bonded warehouse runs on records. If Ian Howeren sealed this room, he sealed his paperwork with it. I just had to find where. Dale Mercer showed up the third day unannounced, the way a man does when he's been told something. He came in the front while I was hauling a tarp out to my car, and his eyes went straight to the storage room, the open paneling, the dark mouth of the steel door I hadn't gotten around to hiding. "What you got back there?" he said, too casual. I'd grown up in a family of practiced liars, so I know exactly what a man sounds like when he already knows the answer and wants to watch you decide whether to tell the truth. I said it was an old utility room full of mold. Condemned. He nodded slow, but he was already walking toward it, and I had to step into his path with the tarp and a smile and steer him back toward the front. "Place is a hazard, Dale," I said. "Insurance won't even cover a tour." He laughed, but his eyes stayed on that doorway the whole time. "You did good getting this cheap," he said. "Real good. Almost too good, huh?" Then he left, and I watched through the milky window as he sat in his truck in my gravel lot for a full minute, not driving, just talking into his phone with one hand, cutting the air the way men do when they're explaining something that's gone off plan. I memorized that. Dale, who found me the deal. Dale who'd worked for my father. And Dale of all people knew the old stories about this place because everybody our age had heard them growing up. That the Howerens ran a bonded warehouse here before the war, that there had once been liquor under federal seal. Folks always said Amos had cleaned it out back in '33 and left nothing behind but rumor. But a man who knew that history would look at a sealed steel vault door the way Dale just had and understand in a heartbeat that the rumor might not be empty after all. Dale sitting in my lot calling someone the second he smelled there was more here than dirt. I went back inside and for the first time locked the steel door from the cellar side and dropped a sheet of plywood over the paneling gap. I had no proof of anything yet, but I'd stopped believing this property had fallen into my lap by luck. My parents came to the station 2 days later, which tells you everything because in 3 weeks of owning it, they had never once driven out to see what their daughter had bought. My father got out of his truck and looked the place over with a different face than the one he'd worn at the closing. Not contempt now. Calculation. My mother brought a casserole, which is what my mother brings when she wants something. We've been worried about you out here all alone, she said, holding the dish like a peace offering. My father walked the lot, studying the building, the old highway, the way the light fell on it. Good frontage, he said mostly to himself. Always was. Then gently, like it was nothing, he got to it. Brooke, a property like this, there are tax angles, liability angles. It's a lot for one person. We could fold it into holdings, keep it in the family, protect you on the paperwork. Protect me? I almost laughed. 3 weeks ago, I was a hopeless failure digging through trash, and now my father wanted to protect me with a quitclaim deed. I asked him plainly where they'd heard the place was worth protecting. My mother's eyes flicked to my father's just for a second, and I had my answer.
Dale.
Dale had called somebody, and the somebody was standing in my gravel lot offering me a casserole and a deed. I'm fine on the paperwork, I said. It's the one thing I've always been good at. My father's jaw worked. He didn't push. Not yet. They left the casserole and drove back toward town, and I stood in my own lot and understood that the laughing was over. The Rutiges had decided the gas station was worth having, which meant they had decided it was worth taking. I found it the next night, and it changed the shape of everything. The old desk against the far cellar wall was bolted to the floor, and behind it, set into the stone at knee height, was a small iron door I'd missed in the dark, no bigger than an oven. It took an hour of working the hinge before it gave. Inside sat a brass-cornered strong box, green with age, heavy as a sleeping cat. I carried it up to the counter and worked the latch, and it opened with a sigh of cold air and the smell of old paper that's been kept dry. Inside were Ian Halloran's records, a bonded manifest from the distillery listing the cases by lot and proof stamped and dated 1924. A federal bond permit for the warehouse, and underneath those folded in oil the two papers that mattered more than all the rest. A promissory note from 1931 and a bill of sale dated March of that same year. The deed for this very parcel, with Ian Halloran's signature on the seller's line. I read the buyer's name 3 times before it would hold still. Amos Rutledge, my grandfather, the man with nothing who came to Calico Bend and ended up owning half of Main Street. He hadn't bought it. Stapled behind them was a county foreclosure notice from 1933, and the papers together told a story even my tired eyes could read. The note was in Amos Rutledge's own hand. He had loaned Halloran money against the warehouse in the worst year of the Depression at a rate most people today would call predatory. The full balance due in 90 days. The bill of sale and the foreclosure showed the rest. When Halloran couldn't pay, Amos took the land, the building, and everything in it for the price of the debt. Everything in it. Except Amos never found the seller because the bonded room was already sealed when he took the keys. And a man in a hurry to look respectable doesn't go knocking on his own walls. I sat at the counter, holding 90 years of my family's first lie. The fortune my father built his pride on. The name this whole town worshipped started right here in the room my father had called other people's trash. A different woman might have driven straight to my father's house and thrown that bill of sale on his kitchen table. I wanted to. I sat in my car outside the station for 20 minutes wanting to. But I have learned the hard way that the satisfying thing and the smart thing are almost never the same thing, and that my family wins every fight that happens out loud and in the dark. So I did it by the book. The next morning I scanned every page front and back and saved copies in 3 places. I drove the originals to a bank 2 towns over where no Rutledge had ever set foot and locked them in a safe deposit box in my name. I sent the bonded manifest and the 1924 permit to the Denver appraiser, who wrote back that the documentation was his word extraordinary and that it would authenticate the entire cash beyond dispute. And I drove to the county recorder's office and pulled my own deed again and the chain of title behind it. And I confirmed the only fact that would matter when the shouting started. I owned this parcel free and clear, bought with my own money, recorded in my own name, with no lien, no cosigner, and no Rutledge anywhere near the line. The 1931 bill of sale didn't change my ownership 1 inch. What it changed was whose story this was. I made a folder, the kind I used to make for audits, tabbed and ordered, deed, title chain, manifest, permit, appraisal, bill of sale. I didn't need to win an argument with my father. I needed clean paper. And for the first time in my life, in the one thing I had always been good at and always been punished for, I was holding more of it than he was. Wade came next because my father never throws the first punch himself. He sends. My brother walked into the station in his good boots and his company jacket and looked around like he was pricing it. "Heard you've been busy." He said he didn't bother with a casserole. He got right to the offer, dressed up as concern. Holdings would buy the property at a fair number, take the headache off my hands, keep it all in the family where it belonged. When I said no, the concern dropped away like a coat he was tired of carrying. "You don't get it." He said that land's got history with this family. Granddad's history. You go selling off whatever you dug up out of rut-led ground. That's not just yours, Brooke. There's a moral question there. People would see it that way. A moral question. I almost admired it. I asked him what history exactly he meant, and Wade, who has never in his life been able to resist showing me he knows more than I do, said, "You think I don't know about Old Man Howard? Dad told me the whole story years ago. Granddad got that place fair and square in 33. Fair and square." He said it so smoothly that I knew he had no idea I was holding the foreclosure notice that proved otherwise. But the slip was made, and I filed it away with the rest. They knew the Rutledge had always known how the name started. They had just decided 2 generations ago that a story repeated often enough becomes the truth. Wade left telling me I had until Founders Day to be reasonable. I didn't ask what Founders Day had to do with it. I already had a cold feeling I knew. My father came alone the next evening, which he had never done in my life. He found me sweeping the front room at dusk and stood in the doorway a long moment, an old man against the orange sky. And for once, he didn't lead with a verdict. "I used to drive past here when I was a boy," he said. "Your grandfather bring me. He'd sit in the truck and just look at it." He came in and ran a hand along the dusty counter, and something in his face was almost soft. 40 years I built this town," he said. "Every road out there, half the houses. And you know what they'll remember in 20 years? Nothing. Names go quiet. They put your plaque up, and then they forget your face." For a second I saw it. The fear under all of it. A man terrified of being a stranger in the town he made. I felt something open in my chest toward him, and then he closed it himself. "That's why family has to hold," he said. "The softness gone, the grip back. Whatever you found, it's a Rutledge thing. Now you'll do the right thing at the gala. You'll stand up and say the family's handling it together. This town remembers who built it, Brooke. Don't make them remember the wrong name." There it was. Not a father. A man defending a monument with his daughter for a sandbag. "And if I don't?" I asked. He looked at me with something that wasn't quite a threat and wasn't quite a plea. "Then you'll find out how short a Rutledge's memory of you can be," he said, and he walked out into the dark. I stood there with the broom and understood the gala wasn't an invitation. It was an ambush, and I was meant to be the surprise. The appraisal came back on a Tuesday in an email I read 4 times standing in my kitchen. The Denver house had reviewed my photos, my inventory, the manifest, and the bond permit, and they had sent a specialist out to the station under a signed confidentiality agreement to examine the seller in person. He spent 6 hours down there and came up pale and grinning. The cash was real, the wax seals unbroken, the contents consistent with the 1924 manifest down to the lot numbers, authenticated, bonded, pre-repeal stock with a documented chain of custody from the distillery to the warehouse to me. That last part, the chain, was the gold. Their conservative estimate for the collection at auction, the email said, was north of $1 million, with the historically significant bottles likely to draw well past that. I set the phone down on the counter very carefully, like it might break. And I sat down on the kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets and let myself feel it for exactly 5 minutes. $1 million. Me, the hopeless failure with $84 and a ruined name, sitting on a fortune in a building my father called a grave. Then the 5 minutes were up and I got off the floor, because a number like that doesn't make you safe. It makes you a target. I'd seen what my family did over a strip parcel worth 40 grand. I knew exactly what they'd do over this. The appraisal wasn't the finish line. It was the starting gun. And the only thing standing between me and the people who'd spent my whole life teaching me I was nothing was a folder full of paper and a stubbornness I'd inherited fairly this time from the same blood that was about to come for me. I went looking for why Dale Mercer had handed me a fortune for $41,000. And the answer wasn't hard to find once I knew to look. I called the estate back east that had sold me the station, the tired heirs Dale told me about. The woman who answered was a granddaughter, polite and confused. They'd listed the property a year ago, she said, at $65,000, and gotten no interest at all until a local fixer reached out and offered to take it off their hands as a courtesy for $41,000 to a buyer he had lined up who'd fix the eyesore. They'd been grateful. I thanked her and hung up and sat with it. Dale hadn't found me a deal. Dale had found a cheap property and a desperate Rutledge to park it on. He'd talked me out of the inspection contingency, so I couldn't back out. He'd expected me to fail, to run out of money in a month, and then he'd planned to scoop the parcel back at a distressed price, the way he always does. And the buyer he'd had lined up, the somebody he called from my gravel lot, the somebody who suddenly wanted to fold a worthless gas station into the family. There was only one developer in this county who wanted that frontage. I'd grown up at his dinner table. Dale and Wade had been talking maybe the whole time. They'd set me up to fail on Rutledge land so a rootage could buy it back clean. The only thing none of them had counted on was that the failure would dig. When Dale called that week to feel me out about selling, I let him finish his whole friendly pitch. Then I said, "You bet on me failing, Dale. That was your first mistake." And I hung up. I had a choice to make, and it wasn't the obvious one. I could sell the cash, take my million, and disappear. And a part of me wanted exactly that, to vanish somewhere green and never hear the name Rutledge again. But that would have left them the land and the story and the satisfaction of watching me run. So I made a different plan, the kind I'm good at, on a legal pad at midnight. I would auction the collection through Denver, clean and public and documented, so no one could ever call it dug-up family property. And I would keep the station not as a snack stop now, as something real. I'd been talking quietly with a developer named Sutter out of the next county who had wanted into Calico Bend for years and had been blocked at every turn by Rutledge Land and Holdings. He'd seen the bones of what the old highway could be: a restored station, a roadhouse, a stop worth driving for. My father's oldest rival standing on the parcel my father craved. There was a kind of justice in that I didn't have to manufacture. People kept asking me later why I didn't just sell it all back and take the easy money. Here's the thing about easy money from people who called you worthless. It always has their name on the receipt. I wasn't signing that. If you'd have done the same, let me know in the comments and let's keep going. I called Sutter and told him I was ready to talk for real, and I told the auction house to set a date. Then I started building the only thing that could protect me when the rootage finally came all the way out into the open. Not a weapon, a stack of signatures. For 2 weeks, I did nothing my family could see, and everything that mattered. I signed the auction consignment with Denver, a real contract with a real date, the collection legally committed to public sale in my name. I signed a letter of intent with Sutter to redevelop the station with my ownership stated plainly on the first page. I had a lawyer 2 towns over, not anyone the Rutledge had ever bought a lunch for, review my title and confirm in writing what I already knew, that the property and its contents were mine alone, free of any claim. I put it all in the folder behind the deed and the manifest and the 1931 bill of sale. My family was fighting the only way they knew, with whispers and pressure and the soft suggestion that I owed them. My father spread it around town that his troubled daughter had stumbled onto something, and the family was helping her manage it. Wade hinted to anyone who'd listen that there were questions about how I'd come to own Rutledge ground. They had a story, polished and warm, the kind people in Calico Bend wanted to believe. They were good at stories. They'd built a whole name out of one, but a story is just a story until it meets a signature. And I had the signatures. Every time the pressure tightened, I added another tab to the folder. Deed, title, opinion, consignment, letter of intent, bill of sale. While they talked, I built a wall of paper so clean and so dull that no amount of charm could climb it. That's the difference between how my family fights and how I do. They reached for the room. I reached for the record. And the record was finally completely on my side. The pressure went public the second week of October, and it was uglier than I expected. At the grocery, Mrs. Henderson, who'd known me since Sunday school, gave me a tight little smile and said she hoped I'd do right by my poor father after all he'd done for this town. At the gas pump, a man I didn't know called me the Rutland girl who was airing dirty laundry. Someone wrote a letter to the paper about ingratitude in the younger generation and signed. But I knew the cadence, my mother's cadence. My father had turned the town into a chorus, and the song was that I was a confused, grasping girl tearing at a great man during his finest season. I drove out to the station one gray afternoon just to stand in a place that was mine. And I walked into the half-good store with the new windows in, and the roof patched, and the smell came up to meet me. Diesel and lime still, but I understood it differently now. It wasn't the smell of trash the way my father had named it. It wasn't the smell of something dying. It was the smell of a foundation. The literal ground the Rutland name was poured on, hidden under paneling for 90 years, so nobody had to look at it. My grandfather had stood on this exact floor and chosen the lie. My father had repeated it until it felt like granite. And here I was, the family failure, sweeping it clean. I stood in the middle of my building while half the town decided I was a villain. And I felt steadier than I had in years because for the first time the ground under my feet was honestly mine. Founders Day was 4 days out. They thought they were walking me into a trap. I let them keep thinking it. The invitation came formal on heavy paper, which is how I knew it was a performance. My mother dropped it at my apartment herself. Mr. and Mrs. Garrett Rutland request the honor of their daughter's presence at the Founders Day Gala in celebration of Garrett Rutland, Citizen of the Year. Your father wants you on stage with the family, my mother said, standing in my doorway like she wouldn't risk coming in. He's going to speak about new beginnings, about the family coming together around the old station. It'll mean everything to him to have you there, doing the right thing in front of everyone. I asked her what the right thing was exactly. She smoothed her coat and said, letting the family handle the property, saying so kindly where people can hear, putting this whole ugly business to rest. So that was the script. My father would stand on the Founders Day stage, accept his crown, and announce that the famous find on the old Howeran place was coming home to Rutland Holdings with his daughter's blessing. The prodigal returning to the fold on the biggest night of his life, and I, ambushed in front of 200 people and the press, would have no graceful way to say no without looking exactly like the grasping, confused girl they'd spent a month describing. It was a good trap.